There's a particular kind of silence that settles over a house after someone famous dies in it, or near it, or because of something that started in it. Not the quiet of an empty room, but the quiet of a room that everyone is deliberately avoiding. For years, that's exactly what existed behind one door in the world of heavy metal. A small home studio that belonged to a man whose voice could apparently fill stadiums and summon devils, but who left something behind that his own widow couldn't bring herself to look at for more than a decade. This is the story of what was actually inside, why it took so long to find out, and why the answer split an entire fanbase down the middle. Ronnie James Dio died on May 16, 2010, at the age of 67, after a fast and brutal fight with stomach cancer. Fans knew that part. What most people didn't know, what took years to leak out in interviews, documentaries, and quiet admissions from the people closest to him, was what happened to everything he left behind. Not his money. Not his mansion. His work. The songs. The tapes. The half-finished ideas that a perfectionist frontman never got the chance to either finish or throw away. When word eventually got out about what was sitting in that studio, and later, what his estate chose to do with his image and his voice, it turned into one of the strangest afterlives any rock star has ever had. Ronnie's wife, Wendy Dio, wasn't just his spouse. She'd been his manager for decades, the person who ran the business side of a career built on dragons, wizards, and some of the most technically demanding vocals in the history of hard rock. When Ronnie died, she inherited more than grief. She inherited decisions. What do you do with a home studio that still smells like the man who used it? What do you do with recordings nobody outside the family has ever heard? Her answer, at least at first, was to do nothing at all. She closed the door and left. In interviews years later, she admitted flatly that she hadn't gone back inside since the day he died. Not to clean it. Not to catalogue it. Not even to look. For an industry that usually can't wait to strip mine a dead musician's hard drive for one more posthumous release, that kind of restraint is almost unheard of. But a locked door doesn't mean an empty room, and eventually the outline of what was actually behind it started to surface. According to Wendy's own account, there were roughly half a dozen unfinished songs still sitting in various stages of completion, tracks Ronnie had been developing with two musicians who'd worked with him for years, guitarist Doug Aldrich and bassist Jimmy Bain. These weren't scraps. These were real works in progress from a man who was, by every account from people who worked with him, brutally hard on himself creatively. And that wasn't all. Stacked alongside those unfinished tracks were boxes of live recordings pulled from stages all over the planet. Shows in Russia, shows in Brazil, shows in cities most Western touring acts never even bothered visiting. Decades of Ronnie James Dio performing live, sitting in cardboard boxes in a room nobody was walking into. The obvious question is why? Why sit on material that die-hard fans would have paid real money to hear? The answer says a lot about who Ronnie actually was as an artist, separate from the mythology. Wendy has described him repeatedly as a perfectionist, someone who didn't consider a song finished just because it technically existed in recorded form. If those final songs didn't meet the bar he'd set for everything else in his catalogue, she wasn't willing to release them simply because there was money and demand sitting on the table. That's a genuinely unusual position to take in an industry where posthumous lost albums tend to get rushed out within 12 to 24 months of an artist's death, polished up by producers the artist never chose, using material the artist may not have even wanted anyone to hear. To understand why that mattered so much to the people protecting his legacy, it helps to go back to where Ronnie's obsession with doing things right actually started, long before Black Sabbath, long before Rainbow, back when he wasn't even using the name the world would eventually know him by. He was born Ronald James Padavona on July 10, 1942, in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, though the family's real roots were in Cortland, New York, where he actually grew up. His parents were Italian-American, and his father, by most accounts a serious, disciplined man, pushed music on him from an early age, starting him on trumpet and French horn as a child. That early musical discipline mattered. By the time he was 5 years old, Ronnie was already performing in front of audiences, which is a staggering head start for a career that would eventually stretch across more than 5 decades. What's easy to forget, given how thoroughly his name became synonymous with heavy metal mysticism, is that music wasn't originally the plan. Ronnie enrolled at the University at Buffalo with pharmacology as his intended field, the kind of stable, respectable career track that post-war Italian-American parents pushed their kids toward, a world away from stages and spotlights. But the pull toward music kept getting stronger, and by the late 1950s, he'd made his choice for good. That's also around when the name Dio entered the picture. He took it from the Italian word for God, but the actual inspiration wasn't some grand spiritual epiphany. It came from Johnny Dio, a real organized crime figure of that era whose name apparently just stuck in Ronnie's head. It's one of those strange footnotes that rarely gets mentioned, one of heavy metal's most otherworldly, mystical stage personas, was literally named after a mobster, not a myth. His earliest bands sounded nothing like what he'd eventually become known for. Groups like Ronnie and the Redcaps were playing rockabilly and doo-wop, working the kind of small club circuit that barely covered gas money, let alone anything resembling stardom. It wasn't until he formed the band Elf that his sound started shifting toward the heavier, harder-edged rock that would eventually define the rest of his career, and that shift is what caught the attention of the guitarist who was about to change his life. By the time real opportunity came calling, Ronnie had already logged close to 2 decades grinding through small venues and low-budget bands. That matters, because it explains a lot about how he handled fame once it finally arrived. He never treated it like an overnight windfall, because for him, it wasn't one. In 1975, former Deep Purple guitarist Ritchie Blackmore invited Ronnie to front a new project called Rainbow. On paper, it was an odd pairing. Blackmore's playing leaned toward classical, almost baroque influences, while Ronnie brought a taste for fantasy and mythology into his lyrics that nobody had quite heard delivered with that kind of operatic vocal power before. Somehow, the combination worked, and Rainbow became one of the defining bands of early heavy metal, releasing records like Rainbow Rising and Long Live Rock'n'Roll that leaned hard into wizards, rainbows, and darkness, imagery that became inseparable from Ronnie's public identity. It didn't last. But contrary to what a lot of fans assume, there wasn't some dramatic on-stage explosion or tabloid-ready feud behind the split. Blackmore's musical direction started drifting towards something more commercial and radio-friendly heading into the album Down to Earth, and Ronnie, whose entire appeal was built on fantastical, mythic storytelling, simply didn't fit where Blackmore wanted to take the band next. It was less a war and more a slow-motion mismatch, 2 talented people who'd built something great together, quietly realizing they wanted different things from it. By the time Down to Earth actually came out in 1979, Ronnie was already gone, replaced by a different vocalist entirely. For most musicians, that's where the story would end. A singer gets quietly phased out once a band's direction shifts, and the trail usually goes cold from there. For Ronnie, it turned out to be the opening act for the biggest opportunity of his career, because within months of leaving Rainbow, he found himself in consideration for a job that almost nobody thought was survivable. Later in 1979, Ronnie joined Black Sabbath, stepping into the spot vacated by Ozzy Osbourne, the band's original frontman and one of the most recognizable voices in the history of rock music. At the time, this looked less like a career opportunity and more like professional suicide. Ozzy wasn't just Sabbath singer in most fans' minds, he was Sabbath, as far as identity went. Replacing him looked like a job engineered to fail publicly. Instead, Ronnie did something almost nobody predicted. He reinvented what Black Sabbath sounded like, and it worked. The albums Heaven and Hell in 1980 and Mob Rules in 1981 gave the band a genuine second creative peak, proving that Sabbath's sound could survive, even thrive, without the frontman most fans assumed was irreplaceable. Both records were critical successes on release, and both are still regularly ranked among the strongest work the band ever produced, Ozzy era included. The mythological, fantasy-driven lyrical style that hadn't meshed with Blackmore's new commercial direction in Rainbow turned out to be exactly what Sabbath needed in that moment. It was also during this period that Ronnie introduced the devil horns hand gesture that's now instantly recognizable at metal shows everywhere in the world, regardless of language or country. By his own account, he picked it up from his Italian grandmother, who used it as an old-world superstition to ward off the evil eye. He brought it onto stage almost as a personal habit, and it spread far beyond Sabbath, eventually becoming one of the single most universal visual symbols in the entire genre. Given how well the creative side of things was going, you'd expect that lineup to have lasted for years. It didn't come close. Tension had been quietly building behind the 2 albums that had just saved the band's momentum, and it wasn't going to stay behind the scenes much longer. Ronnie's exit from Black Sabbath in 1982 came down to a dispute over how a live album was going to be mixed and represented. Ronnie and drummer Vinny Appice felt their contributions weren't being handled fairly in the mix, and rather than compromise, both of them walked. Ronnie went on to form his own band, simply named Dio, and released Holy Diver in 1983, which became a massive solo success and cemented him as a frontman capable of carrying a band entirely on his own name. That wasn't the last time Ronnie and Sabbath tried to make it work. In 1992, he reunited with the band for an album called Dehumanizer, but the same old friction resurfaced almost immediately, and the reunion produced exactly 1 record before falling apart again. That short-lived era did leave behind one genuinely strange piece of pop culture trivia. A song from those sessions, Time Machine, ended up on the soundtrack for the comedy movie Wayne's World, giving Ronnie an unlikely footnote in mainstream pop culture in the middle of all the internal band drama. 2 attempts, 2 walkouts, and in both cases, the breakdown had nothing to do with a lack of talent or chemistry. It came down to how credit and creative control got divided, which is a far more common reason bands implode than the dramatic stories fans usually imagine. The third attempt at reconciliation looked far more promising than the first two. In 2006, Ronnie reunited again with Tony Iommi, Geezer Butler, and Vinny Appice, this time touring under the name Heaven and Hell specifically to separate this lineup from the Ozzy-fronted version of Sabbath and avoid stepping on anyone's toes. They recorded new material for a compilation called The Dio Years, and by 2009 released a full studio album, The Devil You Know, their first entirely new record together in decades, and one that earned strong reviews from critics who hadn't expected a lineup this far removed from its glory days to still have anything left to prove. During the tour supporting that album, something was clearly wrong with Ronnie, even though nobody around him, including Ronnie himself, understood exactly what yet. He was in real physical pain on some nights, reportedly doubled over backstage before walking out and performing full sets anyway, pushing through discomfort while his own bandmates had no idea how serious it had actually become. He and Wendy had already consulted a specialist about ongoing digestive issues before the tour even started, and at the time, every test came back clear, his heart checked out fine, and a battery of standard exams found nothing alarming. So the tour kept going, all the way to what would turn out to be Ronnie's final live performance on August 29, 2009, in Atlantic City. Nobody in that room had any idea it was the last time they'd ever see him perform. Just months after that final show, in November 2009, Ronnie was diagnosed with stomach cancer. His camp's initial public statement described it as early stage, and treatment began immediately at the Mayo Clinic, with real hope that he'd be back on stage before long. The truth, as it later came out, was considerably harsher. According to Sabbath bandmate Geezer Butler, by the time doctors actually identified what was wrong, the cancer had already progressed to stage 4 and was inoperable. Doctors reportedly told the family that if Ronnie had gotten a routine colonoscopy even a year or two earlier, treatment might have had a real chance of working. Instead, months of misread symptoms, combined with a tour schedule that simply never stopped, had quietly used up time nobody realized was running out. Ronnie transferred to MD Anderson Cancer Center in Houston, where he underwent aggressive chemotherapy while continuing to speak publicly and optimistically about beating the disease outright. In April 2010, he made one final public appearance, showing up in person at the Revolver Golden Gods Awards to accept the honor for Best Metal Singer. For fans watching, that appearance sparked real hope that he might actually pull through, since he looked and sounded far more like himself than anyone expected after months of aggressive treatment. He didn't pull through. Ronnie James Dio died on May 16, 2010, at 67 years old, with close friends and family able to say their private goodbyes beforehand. Wendy's public statement afterward described her heart as broken, while also acknowledging just how deeply loved Ronnie had been by fans across the entire world. That should have been the end of the story. In a lot of ways, it was only the beginning of a far messier, far more complicated one, because figuring out what to actually do with everything Ronnie had built turned out to be one of the more contentious afterlives in modern rock history. After Ronnie's death, Wendy took full control of his legacy, continuing to run Niji Entertainment, the record label and management company the two of them had built together over the course of their relationship. Along the way, she's also had to publicly and repeatedly shut down persistent internet rumors that she and Ronnie had secretly divorced before his death, something she has flatly denied every time it resurfaces, insisting the two of them remained together until the day he died. One of the very first major moves after his passing was the establishment of the Ronnie James Dio Stand Up and Shout Cancer Fund, a charity that has since raised more than $2 million for cancer research and awareness. That fund runs annual fundraising events like Ride for Ronnie and Bowl for Ronnie, both of which continue to this day, drawing in musicians and longtime fans who never got the chance to properly say goodbye while he was still alive. A tribute album followed years later, featuring artists like Metallica and Rob Halford covering Ronnie's songs, with the proceeds funneled straight back into that same cause. Then came the decision that actually split his fanbase in half, and it wasn't about a song at all. It was about his image. In 2016, a company called iLusion built a hologram of Ronnie James Dio, debuting it in front of a crowd of more than 75,000 people at a festival in Germany. 3 years later, the hologram went on an actual tour, performing alongside a live backing band made up of former Dio and Sabbath collaborators, with the vocals pulled directly from Ronnie's real recordings throughout his career rather than any kind of synthesized or AI-generated voice. The reaction, in a lot of corners of the metal world, was brutal. One major metal publication, Kerrang!, didn't hold back. The outlet called the entire project a failure and said outright that it needed to stop, describing it as a lifeless imitation being used to sell tickets to fans who couldn't accept that Ronnie was actually gone, and openly questioning whether it was even ethical to put a digital recreation of a dead performer on a paid touring circuit in the first place. Wendy defended the project in public, insisting it was meant purely as a tribute, and that the fans who actually turned up to see it loved the experience. But privately, the financial reality told a very different story. The hologram reportedly cost well over $2 million to build, and by Wendy's own admission years later, that money still hadn't been earned back. Eventually, she pulled the plug on any future hologram tours, calling the entire venture an experiment she had no interest in repeating. In its place, she shifted toward a different approach entirely, using restored film footage of Ronnie pulled from old multi-camera concert recordings, paired with modern special effects and a live band performing alongside the footage. It's a version of the show she's described as something she believes fans connect with more honestly than a projected digital hologram ever could. The hologram wasn't the only piece of Ronnie's archive that kept resurfacing years after his death. In 2020, an old live recording from a 1986 concert in Philadelphia was pulled out of the vault and released publicly for the first time, giving fans an entirely new piece of his catalog decades after it was originally performed. It's a much smaller, quieter story than the hologram controversy, but it fits the same overall pattern. Pieces of Ronnie's career kept emerging long after his death, some celebrated, some controversial, almost none of it planned out or scheduled in advance. In the years since, Ronnie's story has continued to expand through more personal means as well. In 2021, a posthumous autobiography built from his own notes and recollections, co-written with journalist Mick Wall, gave fans decades of stories told in his own words for the very first time. A year later, a documentary followed, one that Wendy has described as an attempt to finally let people understand the man behind the stage persona, since she felt he'd been somewhat overlooked as a person while he was alive to actually appreciate that kind of recognition. She said the documentary brought her to tears the first time she saw how Ronnie was portrayed on screen. Wendy has also opened up about how tightly Ronnie guarded his closest friendships outside the spotlight, mentioning genuine, lasting bonds with Judas Priest's Rob Halford and Motorhead's Lemmy Kilmister, two other larger-than-life frontmen who apparently chose their close friends as carefully as Ronnie did. That friendship with Lemmy reportedly ran deep enough that Wendy was there in person just 2 hours before Lemmy himself passed away in 2015, a small but telling detail about how tightly knit that particular circle of legendary rock voices actually was behind the scenes, away from the music entirely. Strip away the hologram controversy, the charity work, and the archival releases, and the real answer to what did they find is almost anticlimactic in its honesty. Unfinished songs that a perfectionist never got to complete, boxes of live tapes documenting a career that spanned continents, and a widow who cared more about protecting her husband's standards than cashing in on his name the moment he was gone. No scandal. No hidden second family, no secret fortune, no shocking betrayal. Just a locked door, a mountain of unreleased material, and a decade of restraint that runs completely against how the music industry usually treats a dead artist's unfinished work. That restraint is, in its own way, the most surprising part of this entire story. Most posthumous catalogs get raided fast, polished up, auto-tuned, remixed by producers the artist never worked with while alive, and shipped out within a year or two to catch a wave of grief-driven sales. Wendy did the opposite. She sat on genuinely valuable, commercially viable material for over a decade because she didn't think it met the standard Ronnie held for himself. Whether or not you agree with every decision that came after, the hologram especially remains a genuinely divisive call. That initial instinct to protect the work rather than exploit it says something about the difference between managing an artist's business and actually understanding who they were as one. Between the vault that stayed locked for years, the hologram experiment that divided his own fanbase, and the steady trickle of vault tapes, books, and documentaries that have kept surfacing well past 2010, one thing is clear: Ronnie James Dio's story didn't end the day he died. It just moved behind a door that took his own family more than 10 years to finally walk back through. It's worth stepping back and comparing this to how other estates have handled the exact same problem, because the contrast makes Wendy's decision look even stranger by industry standards. When a major artist dies mid-career, the commercial machine around them almost never pauses. Unreleased material from other iconic musicians has surfaced within a couple of years of their deaths again and again, sometimes finished by producers the artist never chose, sparking their own separate controversies over authenticity. The pattern across the industry is remarkably consistent. Grief creates a sales window, and labels or estates tend to move fast to catch it before public attention drifts elsewhere. Ronnie's estate did the opposite of almost everything that pattern predicts. There was no rushed compilation of half-finished vocal takes stitched together with session musicians filling in the blanks. There was no posthumous duet pairing Ronnie's old vocal stems with a current artist chasing a viral moment. For over a decade, the material simply sat there, untouched, while Wendy built out charitable initiatives and slowly worked through less invasive ways of keeping his memory alive: the Cancer Fund, the tribute album, the archival live release from Philadelphia. Only the hologram represented anything close to an aggressive commercial swing, and even that wasn't built from unreleased studio material. It used existing vocal recordings from shows and albums fans had already heard. That distinction matters more than it might seem at first. A hologram tour, whatever you think of its execution, doesn't manufacture new performances out of Ronnie's voice the way a posthumous completed album would. It repurposes something that already